Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest is Alan Cranston, who served as the United States Senator from California for 4 terms and is now President and founder of the Global Security Institute and Director of its Nuclear Weapons Elimination Initiative. In his distinguished career, Mr. Cranston was also a journalist, President of the World Federalist, Comptroller of California, and a leading figure in reforming the California Democratic Party. In 1946, he wrote Killing the Peace, an account of the Senate's failure to join the League of Nations. The New York Times named his book one of the 10 best of that year. Senator Cranston, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Palo Alto, raised in Los Altos, and went to Stanford. So what I'm doing here in Berkeley, I don't know.
Well, we'll make an exception because of your distinguished career. What were the most important things you learned from your parents?
One of the most important things was that they adopted the position fairly early on to give me advice, but then leave the decision-making to me, which helped develop my initiative and independence.
And what books did you read as a young person that influenced you?
Well, of course, I loved all the Mark Twain books, read every one of them, read most of Dickens' books. When I was at Pomona College, one book I loved was a biography of Leonardo da Vinci. And then I began to read about world events. And Carl Sandburg's Lives of Lincoln, the biographies of many presidents and senators and governors of California, and a lot of California history. Of course, before that, I read Peter Rabbit and such books.
That's right. And early on, and partly as a result of the circle of friends that your father had, you put your eye to wanting to be a journalist, right?
Yes, I got very interested in journalism. One of my father's closest friends was a remarkable early Western pioneer journalist, Fremont Older, who edited the Call Bulletin and other newspapers in the Bay Area. He was a great crusader on issues, and that helped me see the connection between journalism and the issues of our time.
And you graduated then from Stanford in what year?
1936. So
the world was about to enter a very dark period, and you must have been reading about events in Europe, and then what did you do about that?
Well, first of all, I grew up during the Depression, and my father had his problems during the Depression. And I saw how government, led by Franklin D. Roosevelt, could intervene and provide hope and leadership and solve some of the problems that were facing people. And then as that receded a little bit, along came Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and the Japanese warlords. And while I was at Stanford, I watched the League of Nations fail to cope with the invasion of Ethiopia by Benito Mussolini's fascist troops. And I became very concerned about the fact that we didn't have an effective world organization to deal with such people. And the idea of being a foreign correspondent and wandering the world and witnessing great events and having adventures and covering the activities of world leaders appealed to me greatly. It was a very glamorous life in those days. I decided that was for me. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I managed to become one and did that in Europe for 2 years.
And you were in Germany, you were stationed in Italy, and then you also covered the war in Ethiopia.
Yes. I didn't cover the actual war. I covered the aftermath. But that war never ended. I was there for 4 months, the first non-fascist, non-Nazi journalist allowed into the country. I was working then for International News Service, which was the Hearst Wire Service. And I got into Ethiopia, spent 4 months there, traveling all over the place, heard shooting every single night. They just never did pacify the country. And meanwhile, I lived in Rome for about 2 years, saw Benito Mussolini at a little distance a number of times, covered some of his deeds, saw Adolf Hitler up in Germany, got very close to him one night in the streets of Munich, got a real good look at him. And I became very concerned about what the fascists and Nazis were up to in the world. It was a very exciting life. I was also in London at the time of the Munich appeasement. Saw Neville Chamberlain come back with a piece of paper that was supposed to mean peace in our time. And I became very concerned about American isolationism, the fact that there were many Americans who wanted to have nothing to do with what was happening in the rest of the world, as if it wasn't going to impact on us sooner or later. So after doing this for a while, I decided this wasn't the life for me after all. I didn't want to spend my life writing about such evil people and their terrible deeds. I'd rather be involved in the action. So I decided to quit journalism, return to America, and hoped eventually I could get into politics and government if I could figure out how to do it.
And before we get into that, I'm curious, because when you're doing what you just described, you're a pretty young man here. So where did you get the courage, the go do it mentality? Was that because you were a son of California, or you didn't know better, or what? That you were doing all these things at such a young age?
Well, maybe I didn't know better, or maybe I knew better that you had to deal with these issues. I think part of it came from the self-reliance that was inculcated in me by my parents, and what I mentioned a bit ago, the fact they would give me advice, do this or don't do that, but then they'd leave it to me to make the decision. And that began when I was before I was 20.
Before you left journalism, you were involved in, and this is something that you do throughout your career, bringing an issue to the public attention. In this case, the dangers of fascism and the dangers of Hitler. And tell us about your publication of a annotated Mein Kampf and what the results were.
Well, while I was doing my foreign correspondence work, I read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, the book he wrote while he was in prison before he became the dictator, outlining his plans for Germany and the terrible things he intended to do in the world. There was no English language version of it. Well, when I quit journalism and came back to try to get involved in activities in the United States, one day in Macy's bookstore in New York, I saw a display of Mein Kampf, an English language version, which I'd never seen before, which hadn't existed. I went over to look at it out of curiosity, and as I picked it up, I knew it wasn't the real book. It was much thinner than the long book that I had read, which was about 350,000 words or something like that. So I bought it to see how come. And delving into it, I found that it was a somewhat condensed version, and some of the things that would most upset Americans just weren't quite there as they were in the version I had read, the original in German. So I talked to an editor friend of mine in New York, a Hearst editor named Amster Spiro, and suggested that I write and we publish an anti-Nazi version of Mein Kampf that would be the real book and would awaken Americans to the Hitler peril that he posed for us and the rest of the world. So we did that. I spent 8 days dictating my version of Mein Kampf from the English language version that I now had, the original German language version, and another copy that just appeared. A book was then selling for around $3, normal price. Hitler was getting 40 cents royalty for each copy that somebody bought that wasn't the real thing. And we proceeded to print in tabloid form the version I wrote with a very lurid red cover showing Hitler carving up the world. And we sold it for 10 cents on newsstands. It created quite a stir. Some Nazis went around knocking down newsstands that displayed it in St. Louis and in the German part of New York and elsewhere in the country. We sold 500,000 copies in 10 days and were immediately sued by Hitler's agents on the grounds we had violated his copyright, which we had done. Our theory
for a good
was,
cause.
well, we had the theory that he had copyrighted the Mein Kampf book in Austria. He had destroyed Austria with his army. So we said he destroyed his copyright at the same time. Well, that didn't stand up in court, and a Connecticut judge ruled in Hitler's favor. no damages were assessed, but we had to stop selling the book. We got what was called an injunction. But we did wake up a lot of Americans to the Nazi threat.
During the war, you worked for the government under Archibald MacLeish. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that. It was bringing groups into an understanding of the American story. Is that?
Well, I had worked for a little while before the war began, after I came back to America, for an organization called Common Council for American Unity that was trying to help immigrants adjust to American life and America to adjust to having immigrants among us. So I was working with German Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, everything you can think of. And when the war began, President Roosevelt appointed Archibald MacLeish to head something called the Office of Facts and Figures, which was soon replaced by something headed by a famous commentator of those days, Elmer Davis, called the Office of War Information. And I was given the responsibility of running the Foreign Language Division, which had the task of explaining how price control worked, how the draft worked, and so forth in foreign languages via press and radio to foreign language speaking groups. And also had the task of trying to explain to German Americans why we were fighting Hitler, to Italian Americans why we were fighting Mussolini, and to Japanese Americans who unfortunately got locked up in so-called relocation camps, why that was necessary, although I don't think it was necessary, and why we were fighting Japan. So I spent a couple of years working with foreign language groups in this country on all these aspects and many others of the war as it affected people with different national backgrounds in our country.
Now, after the war, you got involved in the world law movement and the world Federalist movement, and I'm curious what you, in retrospect, learned from that experience, because here you were trying to shape and build institutions that didn't exist, but which you had come to realize the world needed.
Well, you mentioned The Killing of the Peace, a book I wrote while I was in the U.S. Army. I eventually declined a deferment and enlisted in the Army. And I took basic military training, but then because of my journalism background, and the fact I'd worked in the government on things related to writing and journalism, that I was pulled out of the infantry and into something called Army Talk, where I was writing, explaining why we were fighting to the soldiers this time, not German Americans, Italian Americans, but everybody who was in the Army, explaining the war aims, what was going on, and so forth and so on. During that time, I managed to write a book called The Killing of the Peace about how the League of Nations was defeated in the U.S. Senate. The purpose in the book was to make it a little bit harder for isolationists to keep us out of the United Nations. They couldn't, I at least would expose the tactics they used and the strategies that led to the defeat of the League. I hope very much that we would get in the United Nations World War II, which I knew was in the works. And there was no big fight over the United Nations Charter and our belonging to it, primarily because we had the veto, so we could stop it cold when we wished to, unfortunately, I think. I think that has sort of hamstrung the body, was 5 countries having the veto. Anyway, the result of that book, which did get quite a bit of attention, was that I was invited to a meeting convened by one of the most incredible people I've ever met, a man named Grenville Clark, a man that should be famous but didn't want fame, didn't want to be known at all, just wanted to quietly work as a citizen on issues when he wasn't practicing corporate law and serving on the Board of Overseers of Harvard. I was invited to this meeting, which was called mostly of senior people, to discuss where we stood in the light of the United Nations Charter being born, with a charter written before anybody knew there was an atomic bomb. And was the UN up to dealing with this new threat to life and limb and peace? As I said, most of the people there were senior people, but Grenville Clark said he wanted to have a little bit of pepper among the salt. So I was invited as one of the young people there. Norman Cousins, the young editor of the Saturday Review of Literature, was another. There was a young man there in naval uniform named Kingman Brewster, who wound up eventually being president of Yale, and a few other very remarkable young people. I developed a relationship with Grenville Clark that led him to ask me to serve as chair of an ongoing committee to carry on this work. We felt at that meeting by a strong majority that the UN Charter had to be strengthened and the veto modified and the UN given some authority if it was going to be up to keeping the peace. There was a follow-up meeting in Princeton, which I chaired, and Albert Einstein, who was then teaching and studying at Princeton, participated. I got to know him at that time, and he warned me, as he warned others, that if the nuclear bomb was fully developed, which has now happened, and ever used all out, which fortunately has not yet happened, that all life on this planet, human and otherwise, could well be exterminated. That caught my attention, and ever since, I've been working in one way or another to try to prevent a nuclear war and develop the sort of a world where such events would be very impossible to occur.
In looking at the distinguished career that follows, you serve California's comptroller, you help organize organizations, political clubs all over the state that really reform the party. You go on and become a 4-term senator and a whip of the Senate. And it's hard to cover all of this. So what I'm going to do now is look at some themes that I see throughout your career and really have you address them. And one is the reforming of institutions in a democracy. Because one of the things that really makes our government work is seeing that things need to change. You did that in the Senate. You did it in California politics. What are the essential elements, the requirements for making that possible, reforming our institutions?
Well, you have to have some sensible ideas about what needs to be done, and then you have to have the ability to articulate them, to write them down, to talk about them to people and make speeches or use the media on the subject. But you also have to not only have a broad vision of what's needed, but you have to pay attention to infinite detail. If that isn't done, things fall apart and you don't get anything done. So I've always tried to have a vision of where I thought we ought to be moving in our society, but also paid attention to the details, the bricks that are part of the edifice you're trying to build. And you have to draw people in, you have to inspire them and lead them to pitch in with you and to recognize that certain things have to be done or we're going to pay a heavy price.
And this was also even true in the Senate, once you were in the Senate, because you were involved in reforming the procedure of that institution, in addition to all of the other issues that you brought before it.
Well, I am an abolitionist on two fronts. I believe we have to abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us. And I think we have to eliminate the incredibly important and significant role of money in politics before we're going to have our democracy working as it should work. And these two issues, in a sense, overwhelm all others. If we blow ourselves up in a nuclear war, no other issue, no matter how important it may seem to be, is really going to matter. And until we get money out of politics, money is going to affect every issue that comes along, often adversely to the interests of the public. So let's abolish both.
Now, on both of these issues, and especially the nuclear issue, you as a legislator tried to do something about it. In other words, not just giving the country the warning about the danger involved, but actually legislating, getting SALT through the Congress, getting the ABM treaty through the Congress. What was involved in that process of legislating these issues, and how does it differ from calling the public's attention to issues?
Well, again, you have to have a vision of where you want to go and what steps might lead there. But then you also have to persuade people that this is what has to be done. So my favorite sport in some ways in the Senate was what's called counting votes. Mm-hmm. When some issue came up, sometimes suddenly without much warning or sometimes after long preparation, I would take a Senate tally, which is a list of every senator alphabetically, and mark down how I thought each senator stood on this issue and how he or she would vote when it came to a vote. And I knew the Senate well enough so that I could predict about 90% of the people almost automatically. And I'd eliminate them from any major concern, although some of them I'd check to make sure I was right. But that would leave about 10, sometimes 15% of the Senate where I didn't know what they do. I had an idea what I thought they would do, but I had no idea. So I had to find out what they were going to do one way or another by asking them about the issue and talking in generalities about it, or checking with their staff, or looking at how they voted on related matters. And then it would get down to maybe 7 or 8 or 9 senators who I didn't have any idea how they were going to vote. And then I'd have to figure out how do I get their vote to the side that I think they ought to be on. And then you'd have to go to work on that. And that would entail all sorts of activities. Sometimes I would undertake to talk to them about the issue. Sometimes I felt I wasn't the right one to do it for one reason or another. I'd figure out who could do it, whether another senator or a leading constituent in their state or whatever. And that way I could have an impact on almost every vote that came along beyond just my own vote.
In your career, you did this with matters such as implementing Roe v. Wade into legislation on the abortion issue. You did it on the rights of the handicapped. You did it on your involvement in the various détente legislation. Did all of these differ in terms of the strategy that you had to do to win the votes, or was it really just following the procedure you just discussed?
Following that procedure was a major part of the battle. But the other part was figuring out the themes that will affect people's thinking on the issue, and then trying to articulate them or getting other people to articulate them.
But you would think that the nuclear issue would be the easiest to get across, but you're still doing it. And so what I want to know is, what is the difficulty there? No one wants a nuclear war. Nobody wants the world blown up. No one wants not to have a good life for their grandchildren. So why has this been such a difficult issue to move forward on?
Well, first of all, when I arrived in the Senate, the Cold War was going on. It was pretty ferocious, very dangerous. And the idea of abolishing nuclear weapons was a hopeless idea. You couldn't expect the Russian leadership to do it, and you couldn't expect us to do it at that time under those circumstances. The best we could do eventually, and this began in the late 70s, early 80s, was talk about a ceiling on the number of missiles and weapons of a nuclear nature that each of us, we and the Russians, would have. That led to the freeze movement, which was a very massive effort by American citizens to just freeze things where they were so we don't keep on building nuclear weapons. We and the Russians both had many more than we needed, many more than made any sense. We had more weapons than we had targets. And eventually that became official policy under the SALT treaties that did place a limit on the size of the Russian and American nuclear arsenal. I helped get that through the Senate. Then when Ronald Reagan came along, first we had the big military build-up and his talk about the evil empire and even worse strains with the Russians. But then in his second term, Reagan changed. Gorbachev had come along. The world looked quite different. And he joined with Gorbachev in the START treaties, which were strategic arms reductions with them. I worked on that. But still, there was very little talk about abolition. But that began at that point. It began to seem possible with Russia changing as it changed under Gorbachev leadership to think about getting rid of these weapons. And Reagan actually did more than any other president to speak for and to discuss and to explore at a summit at Reykjavik with Reagan, who shared his views.
With Gorbachev, yeah.
Yeah, with Gorbachev. The idea of getting rid of these weapons. So at long last, that became within the realm of possibility. Then certain things happened. Gorbachev left office. The Cold War, before he left, really ground to a halt with his negotiations with Reagan and with George Bush. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Then along comes Yeltsin and Clinton, and they announce that we no longer target each other, we and the Russians, with nuclear weapons. So people say, well, why worry? It's not a major danger now. Actually, it is a larger danger now than it was before for many reasons. So although polls indicate that about 85% of the American people, the Russian people, European, Japanese, and others think we'd be better off if there weren't any nuclear weapons around, that is an issue that's very low in terms of priorities. The American people are much more concerned about taxes, welfare, the deficit, crime, education, drugs, and way down somewhere low is the matter of nuclear weapon dangers. So our task now is to convince the American people that it's more dangerous now than it was during the Cold War, and that's a fact. It is more dangerous now.
Look, throughout your career, you really have been doing this, that is, thinking about, working at, educating the people on the issue. What's the key to making that successful on this particular issue? Just scaring people? Or is it just articulating the issues and they will come to the issue?
Well, I don't think just scaring people is enough. That worked during the freeze days to a major extent, but we really didn't achieve that much even at that time. You have to have more. You have to give people hope and a vision of a better world. And I think there are two major sides to the nuclear weapon threat and issue. One is the danger, and the danger is immense. But the other is the moral issue, the spiritual issue. The fact that we are tampering with life on this planet because of our vision of the transitory needs of the moment for the defense of our country, which will be different a year from now and a decade from now. But here, right now, to preserve what we think are our national interests, we're willing to face the prospect of wiping out the human race, and we're using terror, the threat that we will turn these weapons loose and destroy a whole country or all the inhabitants of its major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia, and the people of New York, San Francisco, Washington, and so forth, over the problems of today in a way that could wipe out all future and wipe out all the progress that humans have made thus far. That just doesn't make sense. And it's just a moral issue as well as a practical military issue. And that's what we have to drive home.
What do you think went wrong in the Senate that led to the failure of the Comprehensive Test Treaty?
Lack of understanding of the issue, lack of effective leadership, miscalculations by Senate Democrats, miscalculations by the Clinton White House, and the fact that a few, very few, about 5 determined, ultra-radically conservative Republicans managed to manipulate things in an incredible way, led to a strictly partisan vote where all Republicans voted one way, all Democrats the other, even though many of the Republicans were not happy with the outcome, but they got locked in. And I believe that it's possible to turn that around in the course of time, possibly this year, more hopefully next year, that eventually that treaty will be passed. But again, the public wasn't concerned. The public didn't get aroused and involved as it got involved, for example, over the Vietnam War, when that became a burning issue in our country.
And will it, God forbid, take some sort of an accident, some sort of untoward event to change people's thinking? Or
I hope not.
Yeah.
Because the untoward event would likely be the destruction of some city, quite possibly an American city, one or more, by a nuclear bomb. That would be a tragedy, and it's not certain what the consequences would be. It might lead to a great revulsion about these weapons and a recognition we have to get rid of them. Or it might be, boy, we better get more of these weapons to protect ourselves against this kind of thing, which would be a terrible response and an unreasonable one, but what could be the response. And actually, there are some very experienced people with impeccable credentials in security and military matters who actually expect that a city somewhere in the world, and some of them think an American city, is likely to be destroyed by a nuclear weapon sometime in the next 10 years. The three people who are of that point of view are General Chuck Horner, who commanded the Allied air war in the Gulf, Ambassador Thomas Graham, who negotiated the Non-Proliferation Treaty extension for the United States, and Ambassador Robert Gallucci, who negotiated with both North Korea and Iraq on the subject of nuclear weapons. All three of them have this pessimistic view.
And what will be the cause? A rogue state, a terrorist group?
Likely that. There's the grave danger, a graver danger now than during the Cold War, of a collision between the United States and Russia, not on purpose, but by accident. There have been many, many accidents where one side has momentarily thought the other had fired at it. And both of us have a very dangerous policy. We and the Russians, both still, like in the Cold War, have these weapons on hair trigger alert, ready to be fired at an instant's notice. And we both have a policy called launch on warning, which means if you're Russia, I'm America. If I think you fired at me, my radar tells me that, or other early warning systems, I'm going to fire back at you before the missiles arrive, so that you haven't knocked out my capacity to retaliate. And the threat that I will do that is supposed to inhibit you. It may inhibit you from doing that purposely, but suppose there's an accident. Well, the chaos, the deterioration of command and control, the decline in the quality of equipment, the fact that soldiers and sailors are unpaid, or paid late, or paid not enough, is wrecking their morale. It's quite possible that if there isn't an accidental launch that could lead to a conflict, that terrorists or representatives of rogue leaders like Saddam Hussein will buy or steal or bribe their way to acquire a nuclear weapon out of Russia, and that they will then have no hesitation in using it. And they won't attack us with a missile. They would attack us, as Robert Gallucci, the ambassador, has suggested, by sailing one bomb into San Francisco Harbor or Baltimore Harbor or New York Harbor on a ship. It's just sitting there. There's no way to know it's there. And no missile has to be shot down or has to penetrate us to put it there. There it is. They bring another, Gallucci suggests, across the border in Canada, with Canada, which is a very open border, and they bring it in by piece by piece. Then they put it together, put it on a truck, take it into a major city like, say, Washington or Pittsburgh, and then, he says, what might well happen is the White House gets a message. Change your policy in the Middle East, or on Monday you lose Baltimore, and on Tuesday you lose Pittsburgh. We don't know where the messages are from. We don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to change our policy in the Middle East, and we don't want to submit to blackmail anyway, so we do nothing. And on Monday, Baltimore vanishes in a nuclear cloud. Then he asks, what does the United States do? That's our dilemma. Our task is to prevent that by getting rid of these weapons before they're used in such ways.
Looking back at your career, Senator Cranston, there has really been a concern about shaping, creating, forming new institutions to deal with problems. The nuclear problem is a problem that transcends the state. it transcends sovereignty if we're really going to adequately address it. Looking down the road, do you think that we will have to reconcile ourselves to the continued existence of state powers and states negotiating, or will we ever fulfill these dreams that you had after World War II?
Well, there will always be nations. The United States will last a long, long time, I believe, and the idea of France, of Germany, of Japan, China, other nations, they're going to exist. But they are losing their significance and ability to deal with certain matters. As Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, once quite eloquently put it, the nation state is too big for the small problems and too small for the big problems. There are things like global warming and warfare between nations and other problems that cannot be dealt with by a nation alone. It has to be done in cooperation with others. And just plain cooperation doesn't always work. If you depend upon the good faith of the other party, they may or may not go along. Virtually all the wars going on now, and there are some 30 right now raging around the world, most of them civil wars, are over the issue of sovereignty. Who gets to have sovereignty where? That's been in part at the root of every war we've fought in this century. There were sovereign issues that led in part to World War I, in part to World War II. In Vietnam, it was a sovereignty issue in good part, along with ideology. In Korea, it was also a sovereignty issue between North and South, plus, again, ideology, communism versus democracy, and so forth. The concept of sovereignty, I believe, has to be changed. There isn't just national sovereignty. We give some of our sovereignty, which is the power to make decisions for us and things we can't do alone, to a city like Berkeley or San Francisco or New York, to a state like California or Minnesota or whatever, to a nation like the United States or France or Germany. But there's no place to put any sovereignty on the world basis where you can place a little bit of your sovereignty there to deal with these problems that cannot be dealt with by nations alone. So we have to get over the idea, which is presently the general notion, that sovereignty belongs only to nations. It belongs to individuals. And we give our sovereignty to various levels of government to do certain things that cannot be done without doing so. And you don't want the nation dealing with Berkeley problems. You don't want the state dealing with Berkeley problems. So you give some sovereignty to Berkeley, and as I said, on up the other elsewhere. That was the concept of the founding fathers of the United States. They saw sovereignty as something that we give to various levels. So we've arrived at the point, the last point, where we have to recognize that we need to place a limited, carefully defined amount of our sovereignty in a world institution, presumably the United Nations, in order to have it capable of making decisions that can achieve what we want to be achieved, but cannot do alone, and our nation cannot do alone.
And is humanitarian intervention another issue like nuclear weapons where that kind of work has to be done at a higher level?
I believe so. We could have prevented the slaughter in Rwanda had we acted, but in that case we didn't choose to act. Sometimes we act, sometimes we don't act. And one of the problems is that there's no world peace or police force to act. The UN, if it wants to intervene, and that depends upon unanimity in the Security Council where the decisions get made and can be vetoed by any one of the permanent Big Five members, it depends if we decide to intervene on then persuading the United States and France and other countries to provide troops from their own armed forces for the purpose. And sometimes they'll do it, sometimes they won't. And there are politicians in our country and elsewhere who say, American boys will never fight under any foreign leader under the UN flag or for a UN mission. They've got to be commanded by Americans. When each nation tends to adopt that viewpoint, the system's not going to work. And furthermore, there's no power of purse in the UN to finance the operation. They have to beg the United States to pay its dues so we can do what we're supposed to do at the UN. And sometimes we pay them, sometimes we don't, depending on how we feel about the UN at that point. That has to be changed by giving the UN some authority. And one thing I think would help tremendously on this intervention business is creating a volunteer United Nations peace force, which would consist of young men who volunteer to serve the world in this capacity, who would be under the control of the Security Council, hopefully a Security Council modified in some ways so it can work better. But then there'd be a force ready to go. But you also have to provide some funding to ensure that it will be capable of going.
I'm curious what your thoughts are about whether we're ready for this kind of forward movement that you're talking about with regard to giving a piece of sovereignty to international organizations. Do you think, for example, that we've learned the right lessons from the Vietnam War so that we can intervene or participate in the kind of intervention that you're talking about for humanitarian purposes?
No, we have a long way to go in persuading and educating citizens and leaders that this is the way to go. And the abolition of nuclear weapons may help lead us in that direction, because while there's now widespread acceptance of the fact that we should reduce the numbers in the arsenals of the United States and Russia under the START process down to much lower numbers than where we are now. When we started the process, each of us had over 30,000 nuclear weapons. We're down now to around 6,000 to 7,000 of strategic weapons in each arsenal. We've agreed under START 2, when it's totally ratified, if it is, it hasn't been yet, to go down to 3,500 on each side. And Yeltsin and Clinton agreed to go down in START 3 to 2,000 or 2,500. It's possible to go lower, that we will go lower, maybe down to 1,000, and then maybe down to 500. But the issue then is, how do you get to zero? How can you get to zero? That hasn't been thought through adequately yet. How do you get to zero in a way that we can believe and know will work? That there will be adequate inspection, verification, and an enforcement process that's reliable, unlike the present system where you have to depend upon a veto-ridden UN Security Council to make the decision on behalf of the world. I believe that as we convince people we have to get rid of these weapons and then begin to talk about how we make that last step eventually, which will be years ahead, down to zero, that will compel us to think through the need for a UN that can function effectively.
And be involved in humanitarian interventions where it's not a question of nuclear weapons, but a question of deployment of force to stop civil conflicts.
Right.
Looking back at your career, Senator Cranston, I assume that you would advise young people not to give up on politics, even in the cynical age we live in. Is that correct?
Yes, I would. Many forces help make the decisions in our society and in our world. Concepts of philosophy, of education, of science, which is having a profound impact now. Views of ethics and morality and practicality. But many, by no means all, but many of the decisions are finally made by people who run for and hold, for fleeting moments, governmental, political positions. And if you don't pay attention to who's there, it's going to be hard to get the right decisions finally made after all these other forces have their input.
And that involves also choosing to be one of the people making the decisions, right?
Yes, it does. Somebody has to choose to be there who has some sensible ideas about what ought to be done there.
And looking at your life, it's very clear that even as a young person just out of Stanford, values were very important in your work as a journalist, but also, and more importantly, when you entered the political realm. Always having a sort of a sense of value, whether it was nuclear weapons or helping the disadvantaged, and bringing that to the process and making the process instrumental to that.
Yes, it's important to recognize that many people working together can do things which individuals working alone cannot do alone. An individual can have profound impact if that person has some values, has some goals, and figures out sensible ways to pursue them. But in the long run, it takes common action and decision-making through the processes of democracy. And one odd thing that's going on in the world right now, I think, is that democracy seems to be on the march. More and more hierarchical, dictatorial nations are falling by the wayside and being replaced by democracy. We don't yet know if that's a permanent trend or what it really is, but that's what's been happening. Hierarchies generally don't seem to be working anymore, not only in countries, but in corporations and in non-government organizations. Unless you have a sense of values that's shared by people and turns them loose to do certain things on their own within the sense of values, the organization, whether a nation, a corporation, a citizen group, just doesn't work very well. But meanwhile, right now, we have the sovereignty issue, people fighting over being able to make their own decisions in their own small place in the world or large place. And you have the idea of globalism. And globalism right now is not being guided by any democratic principles. A global society is emerging, but democratic processes are not yet involved in having that emerge. It's basically being fostered by science and by corporations that take advantage of what science is producing to find new ways to market, to communicate, to do this, to do that. And that's leading to this global society, but without democratic principles adequately involved. And that gets back to the need to turn the UN, I believe, into a body that can play a part here on behalf of the people.
What are the skills required to do political work?
I don't think there's any one definition, but to do effective political work, you have to have vision and practicality and learn how to persuade people that what you feel needs to be done does need to be done.
And how would you advise students to prepare for a political career if they chose to do that?
Well, studying the history of politics and government, studying how issues have been dealt with, how the abolitionists of an earlier day brought about abolition of slavery in our country, for example, how the human rights movement is developing strength all around the world, studying all that, but then getting active, I think, in politics is part of the way to learn through experience at a practical level how this all works in terms of issues and who gets to be in office to actually make so many of these decisions. So I urge people to get involved in the Young Democrats or the Young Republicans or whatever party they choose and volunteer in campaigns, learn how it all works, and decide whether you want to spend part of your life or much of your life in that engagement.
Looking back at your life, what was your greatest political disappointment, do you think?
I don't really think of any in particular because I'm an optimist and I believe that setbacks are temporary.
And what about your greatest achievement?
I think probably helping get us out of the Vietnam War. I campaigned on that issue. I did help get us out of the war. The first measure that ever passed the Senate, cutting off money for the war, which is the way we finally forced our way out, was a Cranston amendment. He was a Republican senator from Massachusetts, and he and I joined in an amendment that cut off the money. That passed the Senate. It didn't pass the House, but eventually that step worked. I think the longest lasting achievement of mine relates to the environment. When you pass a bill that deals with one war or one crisis of one sort or another, some economic or social problem, the consequences are fleeting, and probably what you do creates some brand new problems that then have to be dealt with or that are still around. But when you pass a bill preserving a redwood forest, and I've done that, or preserving wild rivers, I preserved many, or creating a wilderness area or a new national park, that's forever. And I achieved a lot of that, and those consequences will be with the American people for century after century if we don't blow ourselves up.
One final question. In your lifetime, you have looked at these public issues from all sides now, to pick up on a 60s song. You reported on it as a journalist. You organized in California in the political movement. You were in the Senate passing legislation, and now you're running a non-governmental organization. Where do you think you got the most satisfaction, or were they all equally satisfying in the achievement of the goals you sought?
Yeah, well, satisfaction depends upon getting things done. And while all through my life, beginning with the meeting with Grenville Clark and Albert Einstein, before, during, and after the Senate, I've worked on this issue whenever I could of trying to avoid a nuclear conflict and taming these weapons, getting rid of them. I got a lot done in the Senate on that front and in some organizational activities before. But a problem in the Senate was I had to do a zillion things every day. Many of them I didn't particularly want to do, some I had no particular interest in doing, but I had to do them. And you had to be ready to deal with whatever issue came up in the Senate if you were going to vote on it, which you're supposed to do while you're there. So I couldn't concentrate to the degree that I would have liked to on the nuclear weapon threat and what to do about it. So when I left the Senate, I wound up creating the Global Security Institute to focus exclusively, or pretty much exclusively, on the issue of nuclear weapons and how to get rid of them. And I feel now I'm accomplishing more than I could before the Senate or during the Senate, despite the power a senator supposedly has, because I can concentrate. When you can really concentrate on one thing, which I'm basically now doing, if you go at it intelligently, you can get a lot done. And there are many, many people I'm collaborating with that are working on this issue now. Between us, I think we're about to make a lot of progress.
Senator Cranston, thank you very much for coming to Berkeley and reflecting with us on your life and times.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.